Okay, with this online makeup lecture, we'll look at the 16th century in Germany. Uh, what we see when we look at German art in the 15th and 16th century is we see that the detailed realism that was born in the Netherlands, in the Low Countries, spreads after about 1450 to Germany and takes hold there as well. There's a significantly strong influence from the Netherlands on German art after 1450, and this continues into the 16th century. The influence comes primarily through the use of oil paints to achieve incredibly sharp and incredibly small details, and then marshaling those details for symbolic purposes. There are some coincidences that we see as we compare these two scenes of Christ's crucifixion. You'll notice that even though there are different moments in the narrative, the Virgin Mary is fainting again into the arms of St. John. This was the case with Roger, and again on the left of Grunewald's piece. We can also see Mary Magdalene wringing her hands in sorrow with her ointment jar now laid at the feet of the cross. These iconographic details repeat from Roger's work in Grunewald's work. That's not necessarily mean that Roger influenced them. They were just normal for images of the crucifixion. The big contrast between these two works is that where Roger's work focused on a range of emotional suffering, Grunewald's work, on the other hand, focuses more on the physical suffering of Christ. His body is the most important element, and it's tattered and torn and ravaged almost beyond recognition. I have some details here, but they're not for the weak of heart. Grunewald is using the magic of oil paint and the kind of Netherlandish interest in detail to achieve a strong amount of emotional, physical suffering. Christ's lips have turned blue. The thorns pierce his skin in a number of different places. There's barely an inch of his body that's not been ravaged by the whipping that he received. Some of the scars have gone blue around the outside of the red. They're really horrific to look at. His hands are mangled and expressively his fingers are extended. The skin is stretched. We know this from certain 15th century excuse me, my dog just came in. Certain 15th century devotional manuals tell us how the torturers of Christ stretched his arms further than they should go in order to make the nail holes. And I think Grunewald has sort of picked up on that. His arms seem extraordinarily elongated, but even his hands seem like rubber bands stretched to their limit. The nail through his feet seems to pull out and the blood drips off of them. And like I said, this is absolutely horrifying. Grunewald wants you, the viewer, to have an emotional reaction to this. It's certainly hard to be complacent. And by the way, it's well over life size. There's another variation of the composition in the National Gallery. It's one of the few Grunewalds anywhere in America. This one made for private devotion, where we can see the body of Christ. I don't think you'd have to guess that this was by the same artist, but equally ravaged, arms equally stretched across that the crossbow of the crucifixion. The sky has turned dark. Mary Magdalene again at the feet of the cross. Now the Virgin standing. John on the right, rather than catching her, but equally horrifying and meant for private devotions. In the work on the right, in the Isenheim altarpiece, the interest in physical suffering is because of the context of the work. It was made as the high altar for a plague hospital that treated skin diseases. Most hospitals in the Middle Ages and Renaissance would have had a chapel And often these chapels are set up so that the sick can actually see it from their beds as part of their curing process, if you will, their healing process to heal the soul. And this addressed plague sufferers in the Isenheim Plague Hospital. As we see the entire altarpiece, we see two fixed side wings, a predella down below, and the main body at the top, which opens up. The two saints on the side are Saint Sebastian, who you see here. Saint Sebastian was shot full of arrows, but was miraculously healed. It did not kill him. And so he became an obvious patron saint for the sufferers of the plague. We see angels coming through the window to offer him a crown of victory for his suffering. On the opposite side is Saint Anthony, another patron saint for victims of the plague. He is here because the particular disease that they treated at the Isenheim Hospital was Saint Anthony's fire. It's a horrible, horrible, blistering skin rash. Just covered your body with boils, and apparently just burned incessantly. At the same time, sufferers of St. Anthony's fire also suffered from hallucinations. It seemed to be a byproduct of the disease. And St. Anthony was known to have his own hallucinations as well. And in fact, here we see a demon coming to haunt him, tearing through the leaded glass window, about to attack St. Anthony. But he's calm in the face of this horror, probably meant as an example to the plague sufferers. If you're having hallucinations, just be calm. Hallucinations can't hurt you. With the idea that they're treating sufferers of skin disease, note that John the Baptist is here, and he shouldn't be. He's dead by this point. The Baptist died well before the crucifixion, so he's anachronistically included here. And the whole reason for him here is that plague hospitals, especially the one in Isenheim, used mineral water to salve the wounds of the plague sufferers. It was situated directly near a mineral spring. And at this point, there was no known cure for St. Anthony's disease. It was a fatal disease. And all they did at the hospital was palliative care. They just made you feel better for your remaining time on earth. And so the Baptist is included here with the idea of the use of water for the improvement of your soul, for your salvation, and a reminder of the importance of water as a curative. And that would be the case here. Little Lamb of God next to him. Remember that John the Baptist says, "Behold the Lamb of God," and he points to Jesus as he does that. And of course, there's a Lamb of God, probably based on the one from the Ghent altarpiece, directly next to his foot. The wings are fixed with the saints on them, but the center opens up, and so the hinge is on the inside of that. It's sort of down in this area here between Anthony and the Baptist, and between Sebastian and the Virgin Mary are where the hinges are. And these massive wings now swing open to reveal the interior, and we have two scenes from the infancy of Christ. On the far left, the Annunciation. In the center, the Virgin and Child are serenaded by an angel choir. God shines down on them from up above. And then there's one more scene that's from the end of Christ's earthly life and after the crucifixion, and this is the resurrection. This is when he rises from the grave after his death, and I have a detail of that. And here you can see that I think it makes a nice comparison with the exterior, and was meant as a message to the plague sufferers. Here, after Christ's death, he has no more pain on his body. He may have the 5 wounds to which many prayers are addressed, but all of the other nicks and scars are gone, and his body has been wiped clean of all of its suffering. And this is a message of hope to the plague sufferers, that at the end of the day, at the end of your life, your life may in the physical hurt horribly, but with salvation comes cleansing. The wings open a second time. There's a second set of hinges between the Annunciation and the angels, between the Virgin Mary and the risen Christ. It opens up a second time. And we see on the inside gilded wood sculptures of our patron saints and two scenes from the life of St. Anthony. On the left, here we have a close-up of it. On the left, that'll come up in a second. On the left, he's sustained by God in heaven, and on the right, he's experiencing one of his horrifying visions. These, again, are messages to the sufferers. God will look after you. Here he is in the desert with a raven delivering him bread every day. And on the right, you may be suffering hallucinations like St. Anthony, but God is always there. And so here is St. Anthony and his tormenting demons. He's been writing, and there's a little message in the lower right corner that says, God, why have you forsaken me? Because he's so caught up with the demons, but he doesn't see that God is there in the sky in the opening of yellow. So God, in fact, has not forsaken him, even in the midst of this horrifying vision that he's having. You'll also notice that just in front of him, one of the demons that seems to be plaguing him is this green-fleshed fellow with a body covered in boils. This is probably one of the sufferers of the plague that was treated at the hospital. We now know that it was caused by eating molded rye bread, and the disease was called ergotism, based on the ergot mold. So we now know that mold, it gives off a very potent chemical that actually has the same active ingredient as LSD, which is why they had the hallucination. So, just don't eat moldy rye bread and everything will be fine. But at the time, they hadn't diagnosed it yet, so all they could do would be to help them feel better until they died. Right? So all of this is meant to address the actual sufferings of the plague victims, and be a work of art that they could relate to directly during their suffering, and seemingly to be included directly in the work. So here we are with Germany in the 16th century, seeing something significantly more expressive, even though the realism owes much of its birth to the Netherlands in the 15th century. The expressiveness of it, the expressionistic quality, the emotional intensity is something that we haven't really seen as much of in the past. Now, the other, and probably the single greatest German artist of the 16th century is Albrecht Dürer. And in many ways, he represents for us the first full-fledged introduction of Italian-style Renaissance ideas into Northern Europe. Dürer had already been to Italy in the 1490s, and he would go once more a few years later in 1506, and on both occasions he spends a significant amount of time studying antique sculptures. And Adam and Eve in this picture are both based on a very thoroughgoing study of various Greek and Roman statues that Dürer had seen while traveling in Italy. So it's really only with Dürer that we can start to talk about a Northern Renaissance, even though it's not their own historical past that's being reborn. Dürer is very much interested in giving new light to old ideas from ancient Rome and putting them into his imagery. So Adam and Eve could easily be Roman gods and goddesses in this particular image. At the same time, he's still particularly northern in sensibility, despite that classicism that we see in his figures, the use of classical examples. And we see, in fact, that Dürer is, like every other northern artist that we've looked at, Netherlands or Germany, very much interested in the exacting rendering of very precise details. Here's a wonderful gouache and watercolor drawing down at the National Gallery of a little tuft of earth with some flowers, and it's just phenomenally rendered. And if we look at the fall of man, we find there that the botany is equally rendered with the same sort of tight, sharp, tiny details that we've seen going back through Jan van Eyck and all the way back to the Limburg brothers or Klaus Sluter. Now, the work that we're seeing is an engraving, and this is the first time we've seen an engraving, I think, in this class. What an engraving is a carving into a piece of copper plate, a metal plate. And you can see this sort of in 18th century encyclopedia here. You take a tool, which we see in the center, and you carve the lines out of the plate. At the bottom, you see a cross-section of the plate with the carved lines out of it. The lines get darker if the carving is deeper. Lines get darker if they overlap, as we see in the center there. You then would take this plate and you would wipe it with ink and polish it off. So you imagine this entire surface covered with ink. And when it's polished, the ink would stay down inside the rivets that you've cut, but be polished off the top of it. You then put it into a printing press under great pressure, and you put a piece of paper on top of it, and you crank it through the press, and out comes an impression on paper. And you can print as many of these as you would like, although after a bit of time, the lines tend to gray out. They tend to smooth out and become less sharp and less distinct. And so here we see plate being inked, the ink being wiped off, and then finally a proof being pulled in this 17th century print of a print shop at work. I want to look at Durer's use of engraving. It's really spectacular, his cross-hatching to get tone. It's really phenomenal. The use of lines, the use of sort of the sheer tightness of his drawing throughout is really spectacular. Here, if we look behind the knees of Adam, we can see those lines swirling and moving to make up the trunk of that tree. And looking over at the body of Eve, we can see that not only does he do cross-hatching, but sometimes he does little flecks here and there to achieve this velvety range of tones everywhere we look. He really is a spectacular engraver, perhaps the best that ever lived. And this sort of scrutinizing of the image for the various details is something that most print collectors would do, and Durer wants us to do. And so as we scrutinize our image of Adam and Eve, we start to notice all those animals around them. And certainly this relates to the biblical story because God asked Adam to name the animals. So we could do the same. There's an elk and a bunny and a cat and an ox. But the particular animals he chooses and the characteristics he gives them are also related with the known temperaments of mankind, the known sort of character traits that people have. And in the 15th century, 16th century, there were basically considered to be four basic temperaments. There were lazy people, there were lonely or melancholic people, there were happy people, and then there were the angry people. And if we think about a beast of burden laying down, well, there we have laziness. The elk hiding behind the tree in the dark. He's our lonely, melancholic personality. Bunnies are always associated with happiness. And cats are always associated with anger. Think about the term catfight, if you will. How we even will say when someone's being mean, we'll say meow, as if they're we associate cats with that. This all came from Durer's own knowledge of medicine, not only in his own time, but the fact that this had been inherited from Greek and Roman medical practices. In fact, it was Hippocrates back in the 5th century or 4th century BC that had said that mankind had these four basic temperaments. and Durer's animals seem to reflect those. At the same time, there also seems to be some symbolism to the animals beyond simply this medical symbolism. You'll notice that we're at the moment before the fall of man. The snake has tempted Eve. She's got one apple in her hand on the far right. She's receiving the second one to give to Adam. His hand is poised to take it. Neither of them have eaten it yet. There are no bites out of either apple. And our snake is happily giving it over to her. Adam is leaning toward Eve to reach for that apple. And you'll notice that it's Adam's lean toward Eve that sets up his contrapposto pose, with all of the weight borne on his proper left leg. But as he shifts his weight that way, he's removing less and less weight from his right leg on your left. And you'll see what happens here is that as he shifts more weight off of that leg, the mouse is going to be let go. And it's going to run toward the cat, and all hell is going to break loose, quite literally. This is a wonderful way of showing where we are in the biblical story. This is the moment before the fall when everything is in harmony, everything is in check. And as soon as Adam takes that apple, lets that mouse go, it's going to erupt because the harmony will be disrupted. There's one last wonderful detail that Durer includes, and that's that tiny little billy goat on the hill in the background, staring off over the abyss. It doesn't seem to realize, that it's in danger. This is not a safe place to be standing. Looking down, although he's a very sure-footed animal and this is his terrain, still that idea of looking over the edge, tempting moment before a fall, is meant as another animal metaphor for what we're seeing with Adam and Eve in the foreground. Finally, there's the signature on a branch with a parrot next to it. The parrot probably to help it seem more exotic as a place. Parrot's not native to Germany. But it says, Albrecht Dürer of Nuremberg made this. And there's his signature in a monogram, with a D underneath it, and the date 1504. One wonders with the signature that tells the viewer where the artist lives, if he didn't include this as a sort of visual calling card, a show-off piece that would remind people that if they want other prints, they know where to go. Dürer is the man to find, and this is where you can find him. Answers that first set of questions. And you just go to Nuremberg and you ask where Albert Dürer is, and you find out what other prints he might have, because he's so good at it. And in fact, The Fall of Man is as good a print as he probably ever did in his entire life. Not to say that the other ones weren't spectacular as well. We'll look at one other Dürer print, Melancholia I, from 10 years later in 1514. This is one of the four temperaments that was symbolized by the animals in The Fall of Man, by the lonely elk behind the tree, the temperament of sadness, melancholy, loneliness. The fact that it says Melancholia I, and we knew that there were four temperaments, might suggest to us that there would be three other prints in the series. But if that was his intention, he never followed through. This is the only one print that shows one of the temperaments personified. What we think instead is that Melancholia I, here held by some sort of bat flying in the sky, means the one means not one out of four, but rather one means first or foremost or primary. The most important of the four temperaments is melancholy. And for Dürer, this would have been the case, because melancholy is often linked to artists. You think even today of the sort of the stereotype of the brooding artist. For my generation, and maybe people a little bit younger, think about like Kurt Cobain from Nirvana, right? The brooding artist syndrome. But this idea of melancholy being linked to artistic activity goes all the way back to ancient mythology. artists and all melancholics were the children of the god Saturn. And it was Saturn who gave them the gift of creation. But in exchange for that, he demanded something in return. And that which they had to give back to him in return was an eternal state of depression. So it's often said that Saturn more or less devours his own children because they're eaten up by depression as they are yet given the opportunity to create. And this is exactly the idea that Dürer is trying to get across. We have the creator sitting, not creating, stymied, leaning on his hand, holding a measuring tool, but not using it on anything, surrounded by tools and works of art that are unfinished, tools that are unused, a simple orb, a polyhedron, a stone wheel, a wood plane, and a saw, but they're laying discarded at the feet of the would-be creator, the would-be artist. Other things amplify this idea of art not being made. The dog is underfed, sleeping, but seeming almost to be shivering in front of us with its ears pulled back. Time is wasting away. We have a hourglass there to remind us, a clock to be rung, a bell to be rung on the hour to also remind us of time wasting away. And then directly beneath it, with the idea of artistic creation being a mental activity, activity of the intellect, we have a magic square, a mathematical magic square. And it's a really fascinating thing. If you look at any row or any column, the numbers add up to 34. So 16 and 3 is 19, 2 and 13 is 15, 19 and 15 is 34. And any other group of 4, the upper left 4, the upper right 4, etc., the center 4, all of those add up to 34 as well. So looking at the center 4, 10 and 11 is 22, 6 and 7 is 13, there's 34 again. So it's been worked out with this, what was called at the time a magic square. And Dürer uses this to sort of emphasize that art is an intellectual activity, but at the same time to give us the date for the work, because you'll notice in the bottom row of the magic square we have the 1514 right in the center of it as the date for the piece. Well, this period in Germany where Dürer is working and really becoming the first kind of Renaissance artist in the North, with Italian ideas of the power of the intellect and a rebirth of forms from classical antiquity. This period in Germany is marked by the Reformation, which was started in 1517 by Martin Luther, when he challenged the Catholic Church's traditions, and in particular their use of indulgences, and particularly the sale of indulgences, and offered an intellectual challenge to religious faith. This sparked off the Reformation era with the birth of Protestantism, really the separation of the Protestants from the Catholic. It was Luther's protests that led us here. After Martin Luther mounted these protests, Dürer became a Lutheran himself. And it was this questioning of authority and this rethinking of inherited wisdom that led to a really huge spike of humanism in Germany. And Dürer is part of that. His intellectual and artistic pursuits are part of a revived sense of humanism in Germany. And in fact, he traveled in the circle of the greatest humanist thinkers in Germany. He was commissioned by Erasmus, the great poet, scholar, satirist, to actually design his book plate. These would be glued in the front of Erasmus's own books, showing Erasmus at his desk busily writing and reading and studying with a little vase of flowers next to him. So Durer does represent for us, I think, the very first moment when we can really talk about a Northern Renaissance, where the ideas and the definition of a Renaissance, as applied to the Italians, actually begins to make some sense for a Northern European artist, in this case, a German artist.